Right, hello everyone. Happy Monday. Sounds like my audio's alright, so I'll kick these headphones off. I hope everyone had a good weekend. If you have any questions during the stream, the best place for live is in the Twitch chat, so feel free to say hi or ask any questions that come up. Otherwise, if you have any questions that come up afterwards, there's always the Discord, which I will link right now. Actually, let me switch over to the other computer real quick. So there are, oops, well, that's sort of interesting. My OBS doesn't like my uh, Twitch chat plugin. See if it works that time. Right. Well, it appears I can see Twitch chat, but I can't submit anything to it, which is sort of unusual. So I'll make a note to look into that next time. Um, if you do want to see the Discord link, it's exclamation point Discord, and if you want to see what add-ons I'm using, it's exclamation point add-ons as one word. All right, well, I'll put back up the airport while I'm doing this intro bit here. I'll make a note about. I have a suspicion, which is also one of my follow-ups from last time. So if you looked online at the videos from our last flight, you may have noticed that they're split into like parts 1 through 5. So it looks like OBS was disconnecting and reconnecting from the internet at some points. It's hard to tell if that's because of the weird weather we're having in the bay or if it's because of OBS or some configuration. So I've updated a couple of things on the OBS side, and hopefully that resolves it for going forward. I think that's also then where I broke whatever the OBS chat bit is, so I'll have another follow-up for next time. Anyway, okay, well, that was sort of jumping right into the meaty kind of administration stuff, but let me give my kind of opening spiel. So, hello, I am Jules. I'm a real-life CFI, and I'm doing a series of lessons, essentially starting from no knowledge of flying all the way through how to fly to the level of the private airman certification standards, or and then later on the commercial certification standards. So right now we're on lesson 4, so we're still pretty early on. Something that's important, I think, to mention is, although I am a real CFI, this is meant as just kind of educational content, general information about aviation. Hopefully you pick up a couple of things that are useful to you, either in your sim flying or in your real flying. But this is not meant to replace a ground school, not meant to replace working with an actual CFI. If you're doing lessons one-on-one, the CFI will kind of identify the areas where you need the most work, and help you work towards being a proficient, safe pilot. So I hope this is a useful set of content, but if you're interested in really getting your pilot's license, I strongly encourage you to go do a demo flight at your local airport. That's definitely the best way to get started in aviation. And most airports will have either a CFI or a flight school or a flying club or some combination of those things that you can go check out. Still working through bugs here and there, so a good one already came up, which is the chat. If you notice anything else that's odd, shoot me a message on the Twitch chat, or afterwards on Discord is also great. Things that can be improved for your viewing next time. Another thing to mention about the lessons, although they do build on each other, and I'll actually show kind of how they build this time, so we'll start off with a bit of that. I will try and make these generally useful as just a block of information if you are only able to join for a random lesson here or there, or if you're listening to them out of order. So if you've missed the first couple, totally fine. If you don't listen to the rest of them, also totally fine. The idea is that you should pick up a couple of things that you'll find useful, at least each lesson. And I'll be attentive to the fact that folks may not be watching every single one. All right, that's it, I think, for intro stuff. One thing I wanted to follow up on from last stream, we were looking at taxiing and some of the signs you'd see around an airport. And I mentioned that there's this sign that says it'll have the runway number, maybe 31 if it was the Palo Alto runway or something like that. And then it might say dash AP. Let me make sure I get this acronym right. APCH, which stands for approach. And so this 15-approach means that you're, and it's kind of on a red sign, this would mean that you're coming up to a runway hold position marking for an approach end of a runway. So whereas if you just have the numbers like 3-1 on a red sign, that means that you're coming up to the hold for the runway 15, or I'm sorry, for the runway 3-1. But if you were to see 3-1-APCH, you're also still coming up to a hold short, and you do need to hold short, but you're not coming up to the runway, you're coming up to the approach corridor for that runway. So for instance, if there's landing traffic, they may be landing over you, and so you can't, and so it would be dangerous for you to enter there. I will post I can't send a message in the Discord. Okay, let me do this real quick. I will see if I can share this super quickly just from Chrome. Let's see if this works. I'll do it. Okay, great. So that's not working. Oh, that's sort of annoying. Okay, I have a backup plan. 1 second. So one tip for your private pilot study is that you want to get proficient at knowing where to look information up, because there's a handful of things you should have memorized before you go for your test, but there's a handful of things that would maybe be beyond what would be reasonable to expect to memorize, or that you wouldn't necessarily need in real time during the flight. Something that, like, for instance, certain regulatory information about before you take off. So what I just did is I knew that it was in the AIM Chapter 2, Section 3, and so I just typed that into Google and was able to pull it up. So here is the approach piece that I was talking about. So for instance, if you look on this picture here, you can see that there's the 1-5 hold position sign. And so this is saying essentially that you're about to enter at the end of 1-5. If you saw 1-5-33, then that would say that to the left is 1-5 and to the right is 3-3. But the one that we were talking about before was this 1-5-APCH. So that's still a hold position sign, and you do have to hold position for those double bars, but it means that there might be airplanes coming over the taxiway here at low altitudes, and so it would be dangerous for you to cross without permission. So that's what that approach means, is the approach end of the runway as airplanes are landing at 1-5. All right. Back to the sim here. That's all I have for intro things. Make sure everything else seems like it's going all right. Okay, so let's dive into the actual content here. Switch over to my Mac, make sure that my audio still seems about the right level. So, our lesson today is about maneuvering during slow flight. And our objective is to develop knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with maneuvers during slow flight, understand aerodynamics of slow flight, and develop the ability to recognize and recover from impending stalls. This is an important kind of fundamental lesson when we start talking about, well, we'll talk about why this is such a critical thing to go in practice, but this is one of those areas that I found the most beneficial when I was first starting to fly, is being able to fly at very slow speeds and understanding how the plane's going to behave. A couple of reasons for that we'll talk more about, but two just to hold in your mind is when you're coming into land, you're going to be flying at some of the slowest speeds that you'll fly at, and also when you're taking off, you're flying at very slow speeds. And so you need to understand what that means for how the airplane will respond to your control inputs, but also what it means for how the airplane will just behave aerodynamically. So before we jump much more into this lesson, I want to just point out something I did this weekend to kind of show how these lessons all tie together. So each of these is a particular a block of learning that kind of builds together in a meaningful way. So for instance, we have this one builds on the 4 fundamentals of flight. And I wanted to map all of those out and then also show how they connect to the regulations for what it means to solo. So in order for me as a CFI to approve a student to solo, there's a certain minimum set of things that the FAA requires me to teach. And I have to log those in the logbook. So that's, you may remember from some of the lessons, it'll have like, this is what specifically is going to be logged. So that is from the FAR 61. Let me make sure that I get the right number. 6187. So if we look at this particular FAR, and if you haven't, it's worth checking out. In fact, it's worth checking out all of the requirements for student pilots, but it specifically lays out what needs to be done in order to approve a pilot to solo. And so things like you need to be able, we have to have talked about and worked and logged, receive and log flight training, excuse me, is how it's worded. Taxiing and surface operations, including run-ups, takeoffs and landings, normal and crosswind, a bunch of other things in here. So that's something worth kind of checking out. The reason it's important, though, is that I took each of those things and I mapped them in yellow on the right here to the specific lessons we're going to talk about those. So during maneuvering during slow flight today, we're going to talk about flight at various speeds from cruise to slow flight and descents with and without turns using high and low drag configurations. So you'll see kind of how those all fit in. The other piece of this is that you can see then how all of these different lessons kind of tie together. So 4 fundamentals of flight leads into slow flight, leads into power on and off stalls, leads into normal climbs and takeoffs. There's a little bit of hopping around that's a possibility. So if, for instance, the weather was good or bad, or if there was a reason for that particular student, it seemed diligent to jump ahead first, then there's a couple of reasons we could do that. I have these ground-only ones, or ones where we don't actually do any flying. If it's like truly just a bad weather day, then we can go and work through these. So we actually did, I renamed it, but this is the one we did yesterday, is the Tower at Airport Operations. We talked about communications, taxiing, that sort of thing. But today we're going to talk about maneuvering during slow flight. So let's dive in here. Make sure there's no chat questions. Okay, great. So you know what I'm going to do actually? I'm going to pull up Twitch on my computer just to make sure that I'm actually able to see if anything comes up. I think that'll work. Okay, /Jules Altus. Okay. Okay, cool. Pause that, but I think that'll work. Great. All right, let's talk about maneuvering during slow flight. So a couple of references that are really useful. Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 4. This is all about energy management, mastering altitude and airspeed control. The Airplane Flying Handbook has this really early, relatively speaking, in the chapters. It is a really, really helpful and interesting set of concepts about how potential energy gets converted into kinetic energy and what that looks like in the airplane. It's a little bit of a technical read and a little bit painful, so if you don't want to read it yet, I totally get it. I would highly recommend reading this before you finish your private pilot training, because I think it'll make you a better pilot, especially when we start to talk about traffic patterns, landing, takeoff, that sort of thing. But in general, it's a really good chapter. Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Aerodynamics of Flights. This is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And then also in the ACS, the Airman Certification Standards, this is section 7 that we're starting to dive into. I know it seems like it's a really late section. It's just because of how they group things, really. Builds on the 4 fundamentals of flight. We talked about that. So I have us scheduled for 1 hour of ground and 1.5 hours of flight. We'll do things a little bit quicker. So we probably will spend about an hour on the ground, but then the actual flight will just go up, demonstrate some things, how to get into slow flight, how to do some of the maneuvers, and then we will probably finish still in the air. One of the advantages of the sim is we don't have to actually come all the way back in. Makes it a little simpler. All right, let's start at the beginning. What is slow flight and why do we practice this? So slow flight is flight at a high angle of attack, AOA. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. Close to stall or close to the stall warning. So this sort of flight is something we experience during takeoffs, landings, or go-arounds. So you can imagine as we're coming into land, we want the airplane to be as slow as possible so that when we touch down, we don't have a lot of kinetic energy, right? And so we can stop within the actual length of the runway. And so because we want to be so slow, we need to understand how the aircraft's going to behave at those slow speeds. It is similar in some ways to when you're more like cruise flight, but it is different in some critical ones that we'll talk about. So let's look at, let me do this actually. So there's a couple of aerodynamic elements we'll talk about that are really, really useful, but I want to show a little bit about what it means to fly at a high angle of attack. So first I'm going to crack open this one. Angle of attack is the angle of the chord of the wing relative to the angle of the relative wind. So the relative wind is it's the direction of the wind that you're moving through. So one important concept that we'll introduce just a little bit here is the idea that when you're flying through an air mass. And that whole air mass may be doing something. Maybe the whole air mass is rising, or the whole air mass is sinking, or the whole air mass is moving in one direction or the other, which would be like winds aloft, winds up at the altitude we're flying. And so relative wind is it's not just the level of your wing relative to the horizon, it's actually the attitude of the wing relative to that relative wind. So for instance, if the plane is descending, then the wind is sort of rushing up at us, and so that would change the angle of the attack a little bit. So this is just an important bit of the concept, is that this angle of attack is the chord versus the relative wind, which is not just the attitude to the horizon. Okay. So a couple different angle attacks here. So there's a 3-degree angle of attack, 6-degree angle of attack, 12-degree angle of attack. And you'll notice that they say level flight at high speeds, level flight at cruise speeds, and level flight at low speeds. So we'll talk about why these all sort of change. But essentially, at high speeds, you don't need as much of an angle to generate the amount of lift we need. So if we look here, right, so if we only have a 4-degree angle of attack, we're generating less lift than if we had like a 10-degree angle of attack. And so at high speeds, because we have so much more air rushing over the wing, we don't need to generate as much, we don't need to use the wing itself to generate all that lift. Instead, we can rely on the fact that it's fast-moving air. But when it's slow-moving air, we do need to angle the wing up more to stay level, which will generate more lift at the cost of generating more drag. And so we'll talk about that more in just a second. Okay, so that's angle of attack. Let me double check. Okay, great. So I'm going to do this real quick. Great. Okay, make sure everything's set up here on my side. Great. Okay, so flight at high angle of attack. This is one of my favorite videos, and I highly recommend checking out. You can watch the whole video, you can watch the whole series. It's all really, really cool. It's a series of experiments that were run essentially to demonstrate how airflow over a wing actually works. And the way that they do this is they have these like kind of chambers. My understanding is that there's actually they're kind of releasing these, or they have wind rushing across the wing, but then they're also releasing kind of different colored sort of, I think it's like a smoke or a fog or something like that. So you can actually see lines of airflow as it hits the wings. Like you can see how the air pulls up above and goes below, or stays below and rushes around, or you can see that the air sort of compresses a little bit above the wing, and less so down below, that sort of thing. So what this bit of the video is going to show is it's going to show the change in airflow at different angles of attack. So as the wind is passing over the wing and we increase the angle of attack, I want you to see how the airflow separates from the bottom here. And so we get airflow separation that starts at the rear edge, and then it'll slowly make its way all the way up to the front. And the reason that that's important is that if the airflow separates, then we no longer are generating lift. And so if it separates enough that we're generating no lift or very, very little lift, I can't, actually, let me write down a note to look up the specific definition of stall. I can't remember if it's no lift or if it's very, very little lift. But it's the definition that you'll see written is if you exceed the critical angle of attack. So if the wing has been increased at an angle such that it's no longer generating enough lift. So I'll get back to you on that next time. Okay, so again, what we're looking for is we want to see that separation of the airflow over the wing, and it's creating sort of a vacuum with a lot of eddies and ripples behind, and we'll talk about why that's important when we look at slow flight. So here you go, this is a wing flying normal, maybe high-speed cruise sort of thing. When we rotate the wing slightly, you can see there's a little bit of separation back here, a little bit more separation as it's increased. The eddies back here are getting stronger, more and more separation, and then it starts to actually peel off of the wing all the way up to the very front of the wing. Okay, so this is important when we talk about how we identify an impending stall. Next lesson, we're going to talk about intentionally stalling and how we recover from a stall, so doing power on, power off stalls and recovery. Today, we're just going to be flying slowly and then trying to keep just before a stall actually activates. Okay, so I don't think there's anything else I want to show on this video. Like I said, it's a really cool video, so if you're interested in this kind of thing, you can definitely sink some time really watching these and how the airflow over changes. They do a second piece to this where they release puffs of the air at any given time, and you can see how the yeah, I bet they're gonna do it right now. We'll play this next bit because it's really interesting. So you can see that the air that rushes over the top moves faster than the air that rushes below. This starts to get into like the how is lift generated by Bernoulli's principle and things like that. So there you go. You can see that the air over top actually moves faster through than the air below. And you can see the separation here, that break and the eddies that are formed from it. So pretty cool stuff. All right, let's keep going. So we talked a little bit about angle of attack. This is the aerodynamics then of slow flight. So a little bit of angle of attack. I talked about the airspeed and how we need a higher angle of attack to maintain level flight at lower airspeeds. The other piece that's important to know is that the load factor, so if you remember when we were talking about turns, when we're straight and level flight, we have lift balances out weight, but when we're doing a turn, there's a certain amount to the vertical component. I'm sorry, our lift is split into the vertical and the horizontal plane. So whereas here lift is all directly up and down, on the right side, lift is going to be, or in the steeply banked turn, lift gets directed somewhat in the horizontal plane, that's how we turn, and then somewhat in the vertical component. In order to do a level turn, then we need to increase the lift because we need still this vertical component needs to counteract the weight. To increase the lift, we pull back on the elevator some, and when we apply back pressure to the elevator, that then increases this resultant load and also is increasing our angle of attack. Right, and so we're going to have this greater angle than we otherwise would have if we were just staying in level flight. Because we have this increased angle of attack to counteract the load factor in the turn, that means that we are closer to to stalling, we are closer to hitting that critical angle of attack where the airflow would just separate like we were looking at in this video. A couple other things about aerodynamics to slow flight. The aircraft configuration. So we're gonna fly both clean and dirty, which would mean clean would be if you're flying with no flaps, you're just kind of flying at normal cruise. Dirty would be if you have your flaps in, which increases the chord of the wing and allows you to fly a little slower. So we'll do a little bit of both of those. Other aircraft with maybe like landing gear, for instance, you might then extend your landing gear, and that would also change the aerodynamics of slow flight. For us, because we have fixed landing gear, we'll just leave them on. Weight also impacts the angle of attack that you're flying at in cruise flight, and so it also then impacts the how slow flight will occur, both the aerodynamics and then also the feel a little bit. This is something to know when you're practicing for your test. If you go out and fly solo and you're practicing slow flight with just one person in the plane, it'll feel a little different than with two people in the plane. Close enough, it's not that big a deal, but something to be aware of. And the last thing is that our attitude relative to the horizon will be pretty steep. So if we're looking at 12 degrees here, the airplane stalls at about 15 degrees. So you can imagine 15 degrees to the horizon is a pretty high nose up. And so you'll see that when we actually go on practice. Okay, so we looked at these ones already. Normal angle of attack versus high angle of attack. So we're generating more lift, which allows us to then fly slower. Now we start to get into the drag and power curves. So when you're flying at this slow speed, the drag of the aircraft changes. So let's look at what that looks like in practice. So at high speeds, where we maybe would be flying in cruise, let me look at something real quick. Okay, good. At high speeds, where we may be flying in cruise, our predominant, let me start this again in a better way to say it. So drag on the aircraft comes in two forms. There's parasitic drag and there's induced drag. Parasitic drag is drag that you get from, for instance, things that are sticking out of the aircraft. So the fact that you have our wheels are welded onto the aircraft, and so they are stuck out into the airflow all the time, that's a form of parasitic drag. And so as we're flying faster, that parasitic drag increases more and more significantly. So anything that's protruding from the surface of the aircraft increases parasitic drag. Even the friction of the skin from just the surface of it will increase parasitic drag. And that's why some people will, for instance, like wax the wings of their planes, try and reduce that. And the faster you go, the more parasitic drag you experience. On the flip side, we have induced drag. And induced drag is drag that is just a byproduct of generating lift. And this is predominantly something you see at slow speeds. So when we're flying during slow flight, the maneuver we're doing today, most of the drag that we're going to be seeing is this induced drag. And you think about it, if you're moving through the air really slowly and you had something protruding like a wheel or something like that, it kind of makes sense that like if you've ever stuck your hand out the window of a car and you can feel that kind of well, that's actually a bad example. But you can imagine like as maybe you're on your bicycle and you're going really fast and you feel that pushback against you, that parasitic drag from you moving through the air. So if you're going really fast, you feel that pushback against you really strongly. If you're going really slow though, you barely feel anything pushing against you. And so that's that reduction in parasitic drag with decreased in speed. Induced drag is a little harder to visualize, but at slow speeds, we end up using such high angle of attacks to stay flying that it then causes a bunch more drag. So that generation of lift is causing drag. At slow speeds, then we need to cause a lot more drag, and so the induced drag is much higher. I don't really like that explanation. I'm going to go and make a note actually to see if there's a more clear way I can explain why these two trade off like they do. But we'll keep moving on with the lesson, at least for the sake. Okay. So the important thing is that there's these two different forms of drag that affect the aircraft differently at different speeds. In aggregate, then, you get this total drag curve that looks like this. And so the least amount of drag that you can, that you can possibly have in the aircraft is at a specific airspeed. It depends on the aircraft and the specific design, but there's some airspeed that has the least amount of drag involved. When we're doing slow flight, we're going to be to the left of this least drag. So we're going to be over here. And so a couple of things change about how the aircraft will fly. Before I show this, let me give just a thought experiment just to kind of reason out. So if you're flying your aircraft and you're flying along at maybe 150 knots or something, so you're cruising along pretty fast, and you want to climb, right? So we said for a climb, you want to pitch up, add power, and then trim out the control forces, right? And the reason you can pitch up is that you're cruising along at 150 knots, and if you pitch up, you have enough excess speed already that you will be able to just climb away. So there's not so much drag on the plane that it would significantly how do I say this? That it would significantly impact your ability to start to climb. So if you wanted to change altitudes, you can just pitch, and then the airplane will start to do what you wanted it to. Right. So that's sort of this like pitch for altitude model of thinking. The region of reversed command on here is a region where you have to kind of flip your thinking on that. And the reason is that if you're flying at a speed way below here, so if you're in this induced area, if you pitch up, you're going to lose speed. And if you lose speed, your drag is going to increase so much that you're going to start to slow down even more. And so suddenly then you're in a position where you need to be adding power, and you may not have enough power available to you to overcome the extra drag you've just introduced. I don't really like this explanation a ton either. Let me see if I can give a more practical overview of this, and you'll see it when we go flying, so it'll make a little bit more sense. Essentially what happens in this region of reverse command is that the amount of power required to keep the aircraft flying, when you're to the right of this drag curve, right? When you're over on the side of just like normal cruise flight, you typically have a bunch of excess power available to you. And so if you wanted to, for instance, change altitude, then you're able to just pitch up and down and add power, remove power, of course, but pitching allows you to change your altitude. If you're in the region of reverse command, very, very quickly you get to speeds where you actually don't have enough power available to you, and you can even exceed the amount of power that you have. Like if you go well to the left here, you will need more power than you have available in the engine in order to keep that altitude. So the classic thing that can happen then is if you're flying really slow, and we'll do this a little bit in the flight, but if you are flying really, really slow, slower than you should be, maybe just above stall, you can end up in a situation where you cannot hold that altitude at that speed because you just don't have enough power in the engine to keep the aircraft flying there, because you have so much induced drag just from the airplane trying to generate enough lift for that slow speed you're flying at. And so what you have to do if you want to be able to continue flying is actually pitch down to gain some airspeed, to move yourself back along this power curve, and then you're able to continue flying at that level speed. The big thing that's counterintuitive for some folks is you think, you're flying along at cruise and you want to pull up, you just pull up. But if you're in this region of reverse command, if you're in slow flight and you just pull up, you will have created so much induced drag that the airplane, instead of pulling up, will actually start to fall. And if you pull up hard enough, then it will eventually stall where there's no more, well, I got to look up the exact definition, but where you've exceeded the critical angle of attack, um, and the wing is not generating lift anymore, and so you just start to fall out of the sky. The reason that that's really important for slow flight, conceptually too, is that you want to be thinking of pitch for airspeed, not power. So, I'm sorry, pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. So when we're doing slow flight, we're going to pick some speed that we want the aircraft to stay flying at. We'll talk about how you find that exact speed, but it's somewhere just above stall. And you want to hold that speed. In order to hold that speed, you need to pitch the aircraft down or up because you're in the region of reverse command. And so you need, like, the only way to get that sort of fine-tuned control is to keep changing, or not keep changing, but try and find the right pitch of the aircraft for the amount of power that you have in there. We'll talk a little bit more about how to specifically do that, and I'll kind of show you what I mean by that. But the important piece to remember is the pitch for airspeed, power for altitude when we're in the reversed region of command, which again we are for slow flight, but also for landings is a really critical other time when you'll hear that same sentiment. All right, apologies that this section was a little bit muddled. I'm realizing that it may be easier to just kind of see, and especially if you were in the aircraft, you would really feel some of these differences on it. So let's talk about the last couple bits here. There's a couple of stall warning devices that are really useful. In the Cessna 172 we're flying, there's a kind of vacuum activated horn. So as the airflow separates and it moves all the way up to the front of the wing, like we saw in this video before, once the airflow separates all the way to the front of the wing, creates a vacuum, and that activates the horn. So that would tell you that the stall is about to happen because the airflow separation is all the way up. On like an Archer 2, there's a little tab, same sort of idea. The tab gets lifted up by this airflow separation. When the tab's lifted up, activates a horn. Just different methods of the same sort of thing. Another one that's really good to start trying to feel for, and that we won't feel in the sim, but we will try to see if we can see it at least. I'm going to do some live pauses and just see if we can catch some of these things, is buffeting. So if you remember that when we were watching that video, there was the airflow separation, and then there was these kind of currents that are created. When those currents hit the horizontal stabilizer on the tail, so the kind of flat part of the tail, that current, that the kind of like bumpy eddies, causes the airplane to what's called buffet, and so it'll feel sort of like the airplane is just getting kind of bopped up and down a little bit, sort of like you're just shaking it lightly in the back. Depending on the aircraft and the design, you'll feel it more or less, but that's another good indication of an impending stall. Quickly to highlight, we did talk a bit about difference between attitude and angle of attack. Attitude is just your attitude relative to the horizon. We talked a lot about that with attitude flying. We're looking at, here's the sight picture you should have for level flight and that sort of thing. Angle of attack then is relative to the relative wind. So if you're descending, your relative wind is coming up more from below you, and that's a different angle of attack even though you have the same attitude. The other piece to know, environmental elements affecting aircraft performance. The amount of power you're able to generate and the way that the airflow over the wing creates lift will change depending on some elements of the environment. One phrase that you should hear early, and I think we'll talk more about later, but is a really important one to keep in mind, is hot, high, and heavy. This is sort of the like 3 red flags of flying on a hot summer day at altitude. So if you're flying, it's a hot day, maybe it's around noon, you're high up in the mountains, and your aircraft is really heavy. Those 3 things are sort of a dangerous trifecta, and we'll talk more about being ready for that kind of situation and what you can do. But the reason I mention it here is that all 3 of these are environmental factors that would impact our ability to do good slow flight. If it's really hot out, there's less air density, and so the lift created by the wing will be reduced, but also the engine performance is reduced, so you don't generate as much power. If we're high up, again, less density, and so same sorts of problems. And if we're heavy, then the amount of weight that we have to counteract increases. And so again, our ability to do slow flight, you can still do it. It just changes a little bit. And so, yeah, important again to be aware in that if you're going to go out and fly and you're doing a landing, for instance, it's a hot, high, and heavy day, the aircraft behaviors and you're flying hot, high, and heavy, which again, you may not want to be flying at all then if you have all three of these. We'll talk more about how you decide. But that would be something to be aware of, that the kind of slow flight feelings may be a little bit different. All right. I think we have sufficiently covered the kind of intro bits. So one thing I'm going to do is I have all of these maneuvers in my own sort of like when I go out and fly in practice, I have them all in this file that I use. I'm going to try and pull from that standardized file and use it a little bit more here so that it's consistent. Here's what the maneuver looks like and why. But for today, we'll keep it. It's basically all the same elements. I'll just be trying to improve the order here. Let me make sure I jotted down actually. Yeah, okay, great. So let's talk about, let's just get out flying. So I'm gonna switch over to the flight sim. We'll do our, well, let me flip over to the site flight sim. We'll talk about what we're gonna do. All right, let me make sure my audio sounds good. Seems all right. Okay, so I had us on live weather in Palo Alto, and it actually looks like it's clearing up, at least in the sim. Let's see what the, oh yeah, the METAR is also saying it's cleared up a little bit. Because we're in the sim and we have the ability to, I'm just going to make the weather a little bit more specific to what I want for today. For an actual student, of course, we talk about the weather on each lesson and decide and how to make a decision for a go, no go, but then also decide together if we want to go, no go. So for today, what I'm going to do actually is make it clear sky. So we got a beautiful day, and I want to get a little bit of a crosswind for our takeoff. So let's do, because last lesson we talked about taxiing into the wind and what that looks like, I want to make sure that we are revisiting that and starting to put those ideas into practice. So let's see, 0910 gusting 10. Let's see if I can turn off gusting. Okay, great. So we're gonna say this is a very unusual direction for the wind from Palo Alto, but that's all right. Okay, so the way that we would, this is kind of a confusing one actually. Let's do it like, interesting. All right, I don't know why they're, so our runway heading is 310, so this would be wind coming directly down the runway. I don't know why it's saying variable. Also, this should be 360, not 000. Right, well, that's right. So we have wind 30 degrees off of our runway heading. Make a note to make sure. So one of the things I'm realizing is we should talk about the crosswind versus headwind, like the crosswind component of wind. This isn't the right lesson for that. But let me make sure I have that in the future lesson plan. So at any rate, so if our runway is a 3-1 heading, then we have wind 30 degrees off, and we have it about 10 knots of that wind, so that'll give us a little bit of crosswind we can look at for taxiing. So let's hop in here. Start going through our checklist for startup. So we'll say that we've already done the pre-flight inspection. We've done our pilot inspection too, so I'm safe to fly. illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, emotion/eating. So make sure we're all good there. Aircraft, so we've done our walk around, we've checked our fuel, we've checked our oil. We'll see where those are all good. Passenger briefing, talk about what we're going to do today. So we are going to go to the practice area over by, and practice area is a concept that you will hear more and more of. Let me show where the practice area we're going to go today is. So especially in the Bay Area, practice areas are kind of dictated by the airspace that we're flying in. So we are currently at Palo Alto right here. We're going to go to a practice area, which is essentially this area, where that kind of teal highlight is. There's another couple places that we'll often use. One is around here in Crystal Springs. Just got to be cognizant of San Carlos airspace here. If the weather's good, we can go out to the coast. There's a couple of good places here. And then another practice area we'll sometimes use is sort of like here or maybe here. Or we can go all the way to the Central Valley, but that's sort of a long flight to go practice. A couple of things that we like about these as practice areas. One is obviously the airspace. We can actually use them because the Bravo here is up to 4,000. You can kind of see on here. And so we have enough ceiling to actually fly around and practice things. We also like that there's things on the ground that we can use for ground reference maneuvers, something we'll do in a future lesson. I think it's maybe 3 or 4 lessons from now. And then the last thing we like is we want to make sure that we have options in case of emergency. So whenever we're doing maneuvers, one of the first things we're going to do is ID our emergency landing field. So we want to have in mind, if something goes wrong, where we're going to land the plane. This is something starting today we'll do every time. Actually, I have it in this setup note here. So you'll notice that the first couple things on here are altitude limits. So that's partially where the airspace, the Bravo airspace above us matters. But then number 4 on here is this, identify emergency field. Excuse me. So we'll look in the game. I can point out a couple of good fields. In the flight sim, the fields are sometimes less clear, sometimes more clear. So we'll talk about what you're looking for. But in short, you want kind of a open, flat area is a great place to land the plane, unsurprisingly. And so, yeah, so we'll start picking those out starting today. So, but for today, we're going to do what's called a left Dumbarton departure. So we'll leave from 3-1, depart. This is the Dumbarton Bridge. We'll take a left here, and then we'll fly out over to the practice area. So we're going to change this to purple, like purple. Let's do, trying to find one that doesn't conflict with the chart legends. All right, great. Back to the sim. All right, so we got our brakes are set, and I'm just going to hold them. Actually, I'll use the parking brake because we have it in the sim and I like it. Most planes, though, I do just hold the parking brake because I don't necessarily trust it. Circuit breakers check in, run our fingers over the circuits. Good. Electrical equipment is all off. I leave the beacon on. Avionics master switch is off. Fuel selector valve is on both, I believe. On both, good. Fuel shutoff valve is on. Okay. It's interesting that the Microsoft Flight Sim leaves this on both, but the fuel selector valve off. When you're parking an airplane that you're using, a 172, most of the time you would have these left or right for fueling, and then you probably just leave this on. So kind of, it's just interesting that that's how it's done here. Avionics circuit breakers, check those, good. Already checked all these ones. ATIS, so we call if able. It's not going to match what we're seeing here, so let's see if we can get the ATIS from San Jose real quick. So I typically call. You can also start the engine and get it on the radio. I like to call just to save a little bit of money on the Hobbs meter. If it takes you a couple of times around, it's not as big a deal. Radio's off, so we can't do that. All right, well, we will get the ATIS when we get going then, especially because we're not paying for this one. Throttle open 1/4. Mixture to idle cutoff. That's all the way back. Propeller area is clear, so I typically do this inspection. I'll look around just to make sure there's nothing like obviously going on. I move my head so I can see back behind there too. And then I'll call it before we actually start the engine. And I actually will call it. I'll turn my head away from the microphone so it's not so loud, but if you're listening on headphones, I'll be respectfully loud. I won't yell or anything. Although we should yell if we're in the actual airplane. All right, fuel pump switch. Hold on, let me make sure. Okay, yeah, this is actually what I'm gonna call it. So I would yell clear, and then listen for anyone to respond. If I don't hear anything, then we could turn the master switch on. Flashing beacon is on. Auxiliary fuel pump. This one is on. This is our priming procedure. Mixture full rich. And I'm expecting, I might need to bring up the throttle a little bit, but I want to see the fuel flow here be about 2 to 3. Still set at 0. So this is where the sim game is. Okay, so there we go. So now we got a little 2, 3, 4 seconds of that. And then we can bring mixture to idle cutoff and turn the fuel pump off. Okay, so that all should be a lot quicker in the actual plane. You just kind of flip through all of those. All right. And then we're primed. We have our throttle cracked open just slightly. Turn this to start. And when it catches, bring the mixture in. And then bring the throttle back to 1,000. Okay, good, good. Oil pressure check. So as soon as the engine starts up, we want to check the oil pressure. I really dislike that this plane has the oil pressure, the sim has the oil pressure below the green arc when it's starting up. It really should be in the green. Sorry. Navigation lights on. When we taxi, I'm going to use that same thing that we talked about before. So taxi lights, nav lights, and strobe lights for taxi. Avionics master switch on. Turn those all on. Radios, so we'll bug in. We'll go for our nearest. Oh, they don't have it stored in here. Okay, so I'm going to go 1, 2, 4.5. That's our ground frequency. And then Palo Alto we can. We should be able to dial it to that one. Okay, that's all right. So then I'm going to go into my page group for this nearest one to my frequency section. Okay, here we go. Okay, great. And then we can load that one in. So 125.0, 118.0. In the airplane, I usually find it's faster just to dial these in because I know them already, but because this thing is pretty odd, it's just not worth it. Because it doesn't remember any of the settings every time I start it, so to get it set up to be efficient, it just takes longer than it's worth. Okay. And then radios are on, flaps retracted, so we would have had the flaps down for inspection. And then bring the mixture back for taxi, and we found this the last time we did it, so I'm going to reuse the same setting that I found last time. All right. Everything looks good for where we are now. I'm going to turn the ADF off because we just don't need that. I'm using it today. And let's taxi. So we call up and say Palo Alto ground, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra on. Oops. You know what? Actually, we should get. So we're on Juliet, which I just looked at my iPad, but you can also check. Oops. Just turn the screen here over there. So that's the taxiway marker. So we're on Juliet. But I did want to get the the San Jose ATIS because I think that's good practice. So we're going to go over to nearest again, and we'll scroll down to San Jose, enter, and then we'll use that waypoint. We can grab the frequency, although I forgot they don't label it super well on here, so we're still going to have to look up what it is anyway. So now I'm on ForeFlight just looking. Okay, so it's 126.95. Okay, 126.95, great. And now hopefully, if we go to here, let's see if it tells us. Okay, so what I was finding before is that we couldn't get the ATIS on the ground. We had to be flying for it to come through, which is really silly, because that's not how it works. But we may be able to... What else can we do here? Let me see if I can do just like... Yeah, okay, it doesn't let me do any of that. That's too bad. All right. Oh, you know what? It might have been actually that I wasn't listening on COM2. Is that true? Okay, let me see if I can... Oops. Love it. Oh, this thing is so frustrating. Okay. That's no clear. Wow. All right. Well, that's fortunately and unfortunately not how this works. But we'll just bug it in again. So 126.95. And what I changed this time is I have turned the radio on to COM2 so that we actually hear it. And I was just curious if that's gonna matter or not for the sim, like if it will actually register that that's different. And it doesn't. Okay, well that's fine. So let's go back to our normal setting. So we called them up and they would tell us something like, or we would listen to the METAR and it would tell us a bunch of information. And one of the ones would be the time, the wind speed, which we already know, so it's been reset. All right, so we'll go like that. Increase the wind to 10. Turn off gusts. I don't know why it says variable. That's very odd. So it should say 340 at 10. Jeez. Damage the plane. All right. Oh, that's right. So we have 10 knots. With the angle the wind is, that'll be about 5 knots. Crosswind while we're taking off, but also then 340, so we're currently facing west, so we have the wind coming from here, which means as we're taxiing, at least initially, we're going to want to have our ailerons deflected off to the right? We want to dive into where the wind's coming from, and if it's coming from a headwind, then we don't need to have our elevator changed. We just change these. I'll just change the aileron. Okay. Back to the checklist. All right, so we called them up. Let's say that when we got the ATIS, it was information echo. So we'd say San Carlos ground, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra on Juliet with echo left unmarked departure. So again, we've told them who we're talking to, who we are, where we are, and what we want. And then they respond something like Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, taxi 31 via probably... So let's look at where we are. We're on Juliet. And so they probably say something like via Yankee 1 Zulu, taxi 31 via Yankee 1 Zulu, advise run up complete. And so the first thing we have to do then is taxi over to, if you remember, the run up area is sort of behind us from where we are. So we'll actually end up turning all the way around and going back a little ways to do it. They may have us do the run up on the taxiway itself. So we'll pretend they did, which would be, you're welcome to do your run up on Juliet. So we'll actually do that. We say, okay, taxi to 3-1. Remember, the required readback is runway and holding assignments for Palo Alto. And so we'd say 3-1. And we'd probably give them the whole rest of the instructions to make sure that there was no miscommunications. Okay, so first things first, bring in just enough power to get taxiing. And now that I'm going to be taxiing, I want my wind correction in, so start to deflect my ailerons. Okay, good. And then first thing I'm going to do is check my brakes. Good, brakes seem to work. I might have my flight instructor also check his brakes. Okay. Don't want to get going too fast here. Good. Get ourselves lined up on Juliet. Good. And then he had told us that we can do our run up here, so once we're parked on Juliet, and then our wind is coming. It's a direct headwind, so that actually works great for taxi. Am I thinking of this wrong? Why do I feel like the wind is incorrect again? 0. Maybe I need to set this to 3402. Okay, yeah, maybe that'll do it. I'm looking at the wind socket. I'm expecting it to be like, it shouldn't be a tailwind, it should be a headwind, and that looks like a tailwind. Any other indicators in the field? I don't know about that. It's possible this wind reads backwards, but that seems wrong too. Alright, well, we'll keep flying and we'll see if anything jumps out at us, obviously, what's going on with it. Okay, actually, you know what is the right thing to do is to, although we heard on the ATIS what the wind was, we have an indication of the wind in front of us of what's going on. Because it's the sim, I don't necessarily think that's actually what it is, but the right thing to do is to use the actual weather we're seeing actually on the field to make the decision. And so if this was the real world, we saw the windsock blowing that way, we'd say, okay, well, we got a tailwind. We also wouldn't take off from this runway, though. So let's flip this around. I'm going to make this... do 160 here. Okay, how does that? Yeah, okay, so now it's a tailwind. I don't know. I don't know why that windsock seems like it's working in reverse. It might actually be working in reverse because this is an add-on, so it might be something weird going on with it, but... okay, well, we'll use the windsock and we'll just... because if we were on the field, that's what we would take as the truth. So we are currently facing directly into the wind, which is sort of handy. Okay. Seatbelts, passenger seat back, cabin doors, play push out on them, make sure they're locked. Flight controls free and correct, so we'll box our controls. Way out, all the way back. Okay, good. And then, so they're free and correct, so now I'm looking underneath the wing here to make sure that the left, or the right one rises when I turn to the right, and the left one rises when I turn to the left. Okay, good. I look behind me and I can check my elevators going up and down. Good, you can see it through the seat. Okay. Free and correct. Flight instruments are set. Everything looks good. We set our altimeter based on the ATIS we got. Oops. I brought my throttle down but didn't increase that again. There we go. You know what? Let's see how loud this is. It's not so bad actually. Make sure. Alright, that's okay. Just don't want the aircraft to be deafeningly loud. Put my parking brake on here again. Flight instruments all otherwise look good. Fuel quantity's good. Fuel... yep, fuel quantity's good. We'll go mixture rich. Fuel selector valve, recheck both. Double check that, good. Throttle to 1800 RPM, so I'm going to bring the throttle up to 1800. There we go. Good right here, and then we'll check our right magneto. Drop of 100. Put that back. Left magneto. Drop of 100. Good. Too far, put back to start. Okay, good. And then we check our vacuum gauge. So it should be in the green. It is in the green. Good. Our ammeter shows that we're charging the battery a lot, which is a little unusual. Normally it's just above 0, like you can barely tell. There it is. Alright, good. Annunciator panel, put that to test. Good, everything looks good. Throttle check idle, bring that back. So I'm going to bring this all the way back, make sure that the airplane idles okay. Okay, idling fine. And then back to 1,000 RPM while we're sitting here. Okay, heading indicator set. So we have our heading bug. We will change to 3-1, which is our runway heading. Throttle friction adjust. I actually can adjust it on my Honeycomb Bravo, but I like where it is. Strobe lights as required. Oh, I forgot to turn all my lights on before we taxied. Okay. So we do want to have those all on, and I'm going to change my checklist so that I don't miss that. Okay. It's an advantage of having a custom checklist, is you can make sure that those things are in the right place. Okay. Radios avionics are set. Nav GPS switch, we want this to be on GPS. Autopilot, so we'll do a full autopilot check. We want to make sure we can overpower the autopilot. So one thing is we'll turn on heading mode. We expect the controls to rotate left. Good, they are. If I force them back with the my own yoke, I actually can't overpower them. So that's in the real airplane. Obviously, you don't have this control. Like it's the same set of controls. Okay, so yeah, but that would be a reason to cancel the flight if we couldn't do that. I'm going to disengage my autopilot using the autopilot button. Good, and it went right back. That's good. Re-engage this, put it back in heading mode. I should be able to disengage also with my autopilot disconnect here. Good, also worked. All right, so good. We feel we can overpower the autopilot and also we can disconnect it in the ways we expect. Good. Check the manual electric trim, which does seem to be working. Also, I need to trim for takeoff. I'll wheel this down until it lines up with the takeoff. Great. Put there. Takeoff briefing. We will taking off runway 31 left departure. If we have not developed 70% of our airspeed by the time we get to the halfway point, which you can't see on here, but in the real world there's kind of a barber pole in the halfway. It just so happens to be there. It's a nice little reference point. If we haven't developed 70% of our rotation speed by that point, then we will bring the power to idle, bring throttle to idle, and get on the brakes and start to slow the airplane down and taxi off the end of the runway, and then just leave the runway, figure out what's going on. If we have developed that much power, so if we have gotten kind of to the point where we need to take off, we don't have runway to stop, then we'll lift off, and if we need to, we'll land straight ahead, pitch for best glide, which is 65, and fly the airplane to a landing just off the end of the runway ahead of us. If we are at 1,000 feet AGL, if we are at our pattern altitude, then we will turn back to the runway, and we lose an engine, we'll turn back to the runway and attempt to land on a reasonable hard surface of the runway. Okay, it's our takeoff brief. Takeoff and abort brief. Wing flaps to 10 for the flight, and then release the brakes. So we'll say Palo Alto Tower, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, run up complete. And then they'll say something like, hold short Yankee, probably 2 because we're right here. They might send us back to Yankee 1. I'm not really sure what they would do actually. We'll say hold short Yankee 2, contact tower. Say hold short Yankee 2, contact tower, Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra. Taxi forward. And again, we just want to be about a walking speed, so really trying to keep it nice here. We want to stay on the yellow line here. Good, okay. So then we get up to Yankee 2, and we just say, again, as soon as we stop, then we want to bring the power to 1,000 again. Switch over to tower, and we'll say wait 4 seconds. 1, 2, 4. Palo Alto Tower, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, short of Yankee 2, ready for departure. They'll say Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, taxi 3-1, taxi and hold short 3-1. They'll say Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, taxi, hold short 3-1, Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra. Okay, so that command, that direction would say to hold short of 3-1. Perhaps there's someone landing. Perhaps there's someone who's going to take off first. Oops. Go back to my correct view so I'm not just wildly taxiing around. Okay, good. Okay, so we're going up. Depending on what changes as we're taxiing, they may then later clear us. So we'll say that they did that. They'll say Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, clear for takeoff 3-1. Say clear for takeoff 3-1, Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra. Actually, they probably say something like clear for takeoff 3-1, left Dumbarton departure, maybe keep the upwind traffic in sight or some other combination like that. We'll repeat back what they said. Clear for takeoff runway 3-1, left Dumbarton departure, keep the upwind traffic in sight. Or we'll be looking for the upwind traffic or something like that. The important bit on there is clear for takeoff 3-1. That's the required readback. Oops. My alignment on the yellow is not great. So because we've been clear for takeoff, we can cross these double hold bars. If we hadn't, then we'd want to stop there. Get on the runway, good. So as I'm taxiing through here, I'm actually using no brake at all. I am just, one thing is as we cross this runway, wish I was a little lower, but yeah, I'd be scanning this traffic pattern because we want to make sure there's no people coming in to land that weren't announced. This is one of the disadvantages of a high wing plane is you don't have that great of visibility there. But it's good to know. And I really messed up the, okay, well, I'm gonna keep taxiing here, but I had not been doing my wind correction that time, which is not good. So this is something you should be aware of where the wind is. You should be doing your wind correction the whole time. So as we come up, we'll taxi up to the start of the runway. Actually, you know what? I'm going to taxi off and redo that. Let me just pause here and talk about what all went wrong there, because there's a couple of things that I disliked about what I did. So one of them is, as we're crossing the double hold bars, we want to do lights, camera, action. So we don't want to, every time we cross that, every single time, lights, camera, action, and time. We should do lights, camera, action, time. Lights, camera, action, time is a check to make sure that everything is ready to go for your takeoff. So lights, are your lights all on? And I had the landing light not turned on, so that's one ding. This is part of why I was frustrated at myself. Lights, camera. Camera is the ADS-B, which should be tuned to 120.1. This also was not on. So put that to altitude mode, 1200, that's the VFR squawks. That's good. Okay, so now let me get this airspeed, or this RPM back to where it should be, because we should be idling 1,000. Back to pause brake. Okay, so lights, camera, and then action. So my pitch trim is set correctly, my flaps are at 10, my mixture is full rich. So these are all in place. And then time, it's good to make note of the time. This is really important for instrument flying. So I might look down my watch and say, and time is 12:15. Okay, or you might write that down, actually, is even better to do. Okay, great. So the other thing that I wasn't doing is my wind correction while taxiing, which is unfortunate because that's literally what we were just talking about. So through that taxi, then I should have been deflecting correctly. So now the wind is coming, it's a quartering headwind to the right, so I have my aileron deflected right. And you can kind of see what that looks like. As we do our takeoff, I'm going to do a crosswind takeoff, and you'll see me sort of slowly release this yoke back as I get a feel for what the wind feels like. I do worry that the SOC is actually lying to me, and I should have my wind correction here, so we'll see. This might be a really rough takeoff, but yeah, as we're taxiing through that whole thing, we should have the ailerons correctly deflected. All right. So I'm off the brakes. I am bringing in power. And as I do the takeoff, I'm using right rudder to correct for the right turning tendencies. Okay. And keep ourselves lined with the center line. Good. Airspeed's alive. Good. For 55. 5 to rotate. Okay. Wow. All right. Not my best takeoff. It does seem like the wind is coming from the right, though, and the reason that I can tell that is because I'm having to crab to the right to do it. So, all right, so we're starting to climb here. I want to be at 74, full power. 74 is my climb out speed. Good. At 200 feet, we can raise the flaps. 200 feet, positive rate of climb. And then again, remember we're pitching, so we want to have our sight picture of what we're expecting to see at the current climb attitude. So I got my sight picture. For Palo Alto, I'm deviating 10 degrees to the right, which is the kind of plant up here. So I'm just turning a little bit to the right. And we're flying by attitude, so this is about the attitude I want, and I'm expecting to see the airspeed match or come to what I'm expecting as it goes. So there's 74, seems about right. There we go. Okay. So as we're coming out of here, I want to climb to 2,700 at first until we get clear of the Bravo. So this entire time we're around here, I'm looking for traffic all around us because this is a high traffic area. So we're doing that 10 degree of the sky scan. Just repeating that through the whole time here. And then as we're doing this turn, again, so before we turn, we want to lift our wing and look underneath it, and then we're looking for traffic throughout the whole thing. We'll continue turning off here. Okay, and we'll level out. I'm sorry, not level off, but we'll be straight again. And I want 74 on my airspeed. Good, okay. Turn my landing light off now that we've departed the traffic area. We'll use the taxi light for visibility. Again, we're climbing to 2,700 because there's a Bravo shelf above us there. So, okay, oops, keep forgetting to reset this guy. So, my attitude flying based on what I see as a picture. There we go. It's pretty interesting, actually, the amount that and I'm gonna fly due south here. So, that's my direction that I'm trying to aim for. Anyway, it's really interesting to see how big a difference the seat height has on my ability to, like, I know the sight picture changes when you have different seat heights, and so I use it consistently when I fly, but in the sim I'm constantly changing weird seat heights just because of how it flips together. It's really interesting to see how much that throws me off. Alright, and now we're going to head over to 240. Turn down the aircraft just a little bit. Loud on there. So we'll do a right turn to 240. Continue climbing, but we can actually do a climbing turn, just combining all the principles we learned for a turn and a climb at the same time. So, oops, there's 2,800. Right, so I didn't love that, but I'm going to go, remember, for leveling off, climbing and leveling off, we pitch first. Pitch to our level, and then power to 2,400. 2,000, and so we're at 2,800 here. I wanted to level off at 2,700, so a little bit overshoot. We'll keep turning over to, so initiate the turn with coordinated aileron and rudder. Fly to 24, and then I'm looking at the sight picture I have to make sure I'm flying level, and then occasionally cross-checking the instruments just to make sure that everything matches what I'm expecting. Okay, good. And we are just about to cross the Bravo shelf, which you can actually see on the map here too. So there's that blue line is the Bravo shelf. Otherwise, I have it on my iPad. It's kind of handy. Oops. Okay. Now that we're past the Bravo shelf, let's climb up to 3,500. So again, we pitch first, pitch to our attitude we're expecting. We can use a cruise climb here, which, unlike the takeoff where we're doing 76, in this case we would do, 74 for takeoff. In this case we're going to do 90, so it's a little bit lower picture, still full power, still climbing up just as before, and always, always, always looking for traffic. So this is something your CFI will be doing, especially as you're first learning, because you're going to be so focused on flying. But as you get further and further along, that's a really critical habit to be developing. Oops. All right, anything else about my cleanup that I haven't done yet? We're in good shape. So we'll climb up to 3,500. And that gives us a little bit of height to work with slow flight. So I'm expecting about 90 knots during this cruise climb, and I'm getting about 100, so my angle was a little bit too low. Okay. Good, 50 before, then we start to level off. Keep the power in to accelerate. Oops, too far down. As we accelerate back to 110, then we're going to start to bring our RPM back to 4,000, or 2,400. Okay. Let's see how we're doing here. So again, mostly flying by attitude, doing our scans around. We're coming up to the mountains here, so we're going to turn to the right, make sure that we're keeping some clearance. So we're going to go, first we look under our wings, so we lift the wing a little bit, check for traffic. We turn left. And as we turn left, we use coordinated left rudder and a little bit of back pressure because we are losing some of our lift to the horizontal plane, so we need just a little bit of back pressure, not too much. Okay, and we'll rotate to Mount Amanon, which is this one right here. Oh, 1, 2, 0 on the... Okay, so roll back wings level, 3,500, and 2,400 RPM. Lost a little bit of altitude there. I'm gonna nose back up, get back to there. If I'm about 100 feet or so from the altitude, oops, I keep going too low there. So actually, interestingly, what I'm doing is I'm chasing the instruments because I'm trying to be really precise. And because I'm chasing the instruments, I'm not flying my attitude, I'm not looking outside enough. And also, I'm not at the right sight picture. And so when I'm chasing the instruments, then I'm just constantly going back and forth trying to get it to settle instead of flying the right attitude and just holding that attitude, which you can see is working way better already. So, all right, there we go. So let's double check. We'll make sure our wings are level. So we'll look off to the left. Good. Compared to the right. Okay, a little bit uneven. So there we go. Get that back. Good. Okay. Oops. That sight picture back. Good, good. Okay. All right. So let's pause here. Let's talk about what's about to happen. So when we're doing slow flight, we are going to slow the airplane down, but we want to keep the heading and the altitude the same. So we're really trying to hold the same altitude, hold the same heading. I'm going to recommend that you bug up the heading for practice because you want to know where you're going, but you really want to be facing towards something meaningful. So I'm flying towards, I think this is, you know what, I should really check that real quick. Because it may be that the nearer mountain goes. Let me briefly, yeah, no, okay, good. It is the one I'm looking at. So that one kind of off in the distance, this mount is Mount Amanon. So I want to be facing towards Mount Amanon, and then I can bug in that heading. So that's 120. Just keep this over here. 120. I'm a little bit, wings are not quite level. And you can also see that just the cowling relative to the horizon, how it's not quite level. So it's another indication. But we'll not worry about that for now because we're going to talk about kind of the slow by bit. So let's flip back to the Mac and talk a little bit more about what we're seeing here. So, all right, a couple things that we want to do as we're getting set up. So before every maneuver, we want to make sure that we're at the right altitude limits. The ACS